Hi, this is Jeff Gorey, the Principal Investigator for the Transformer Toolkit project. I am back again today with a brief overview of how to approach using this tool. And so I've got a little bit of a presentation here, and I'm going to get into it. It's going to take me just a minute to get it set up. So I could not put a tool like this out into the world in good faith unless I were to talk about extrapolating and probabilistic modeling and some of the pitfalls of using tools like this toolkit. So, the sizing guides, the inventory guide on the spreadsheet are totally solid, and I feel really good about those. There's not many pitfalls of extrapolating when it comes to using those tools. However, when you start to forecast things, you are basically extrapolating. So you're trying to predict the future, basically. And if we could predict the future perfectly, well, then we would all be millionaires from buying the right stock options and cashing in on our enormous gains. But we can't see the future. And so anytime you're modeling, there are certain risks with that modeling. And so as a precautionary measure to do right by the managers of these utilities, I wanted to give a brief talk about how to approach using the tool and how to rightly account for some of the pitfalls of extrapolating and modeling. So first thing, what is extrapolation? I Googled the definition, and I'm going to put it on the screen and read it because I think it's that important to understand. Extrapolation is the action of estimating or concluding something by assuming that the existing trends will continue or a current method for prediction will remain applicable into the future. And so I'll read the mathematics one too. The extension of a graph curve or range of values by inferring unknown values from trends in the known data. So I'm using a lot of math to do this forecasting. Just because I'm using math does not mean that our assumptions are correct. Our assumptions may be correct today, but then in 20 to 25 years into the future, they may be incorrect. And so you as a utility manager understand that. But my whole point with this presentation is to remind you and impress upon you that the tool is not a crystal ball. It is modeling. All models are flawed. And your results are based on the veracity of your assumptions. Another thing you'll hear me say in a lot of these tutorial videos is it's a probabilistic tool. What do I mean by that? I mean it's based on or adapted to a theory of probability subject to or involving chance variation. E.g., the main approaches are either rule-based or probabilistic. Basically, when I say probabilistic, what I'm meaning is we're rolling random numbers and we're modeling results based on the probabilities of an event to happen. And so when you simulate something in this tool, you may click run another simulation and get somewhat different results. Although the results should trend in the same direction, they're not always going to be the same results. So that's important to understand too. There's a part of the tool where we're averaging a certain number of simulations to get a more representative sample. And so, that is the only way to do this in Excel without involving a bank of supercomputers to do super advanced modeling. So, why is this form of modeling risky? Well, any prediction of the future is risky. But when you're talking about assigning probabilities to an event that it will happen, and then you're rolling the dice on that probability many, many times, you're going to get things that happen that are a very low chance on their own of happening, but because you've flipped a coin a million times, certain unlikely things will happen, which is true to real life, but it's important to understand what's going on there. So, what is the big problem with extrapolation? Extrapolation basically assumes that patterns observed in your data will continue unchanged into unobserved territory. This works pretty well with short-term predictions in stable systems. but breaks down when the underlying conditions change. So if we make an assumption about EV adoption rates, and then 5 years from now we create some new form of energy that's, it's not free energy according to the laws of thermodynamics, but maybe it's not pulling from the electric grid, well, your assumptions have changed massively. You may have oversized a transformer by 30 kVA for a use that is not going to exist in the future. So that's something to be aware of. A classic example of this is extrapolating economic data growth, or extrapolating economic growth during a boom period. So if we had extrapolated economic growth during the roaring 20s, it would be a lot different in 2025 than if we had a real simulation of the ups and downs of the economy, right? So that's one thing to note. It's a mathematical relationship that we're modeling, and this relationship we've identified may only hold within the range of our observations and our assumptions. Beyond the current range, entirely different forces may come into play. And so that's something to note. Moving on to the second point, probabilistic modeling limitations. These models rely on assumptions about distributions, and they also rely on the idea that our assumptions are independent of one another. That independence may not hold in reality. There may be more interdependent variables that we haven't captured on the assumptions tab. And so, an example of that would be like the 2008 financial crisis. When that was going on, it partially stemmed from the risk models that, the people that were putting in those mortgage-backed securities, their risk models underestimated the probability of extreme events because they assumed normal market behavior and the fact that everyone would always pay those loans. And so it's an example of the risk of probabilistic modeling. These models also struggle with black swan events, rare but insanely high impact events that could fall outside of our historical patterns. And so that's something to think of too. Moving on to the third point, the trap when you're using these extrapolating models it's called the overconfidence trap. Mathematical models provide precise-looking numbers that can create false confidence. This tool is not saying for sure that X amount of transformers will fail, and those transformers that fail will be this size. They're not saying that at all. They're just modeling outcomes based on probabilities. You shouldn't look into the future on this tool 10 years from now and say, I need to buy this many transformers in 10 years. What you should be saying is, there's a very high likelihood that this number of transformers will fail, so I should be managing my inventory strategically to meet that future need. So don't become overconfident in these numbers. The model's assumptions, data quality, structural limitations introduce uncertainties that are difficult to quantify, but may be far larger than the model suggests. The fourth and fifth point are kind of connected, talking about dynamic systems, and third, fourth, and N+ order effects. Basically, many real-world systems are dynamic and adaptive. Human behavior changes in response to predictions, creating feedback loops that could invalidate the original model. For example, if people say, oh, we're all going to have EVs in 10 years, and people keep believing that, it could influence, the actual outcome. So that is one thing to be thinking about. And then when it comes to third, fourth, and N+ order effects, we're talking about unintended interrelated variables that we may not be modeling are interrelated. For example, like if load growth goes up, and in 20 years it's 100%, it's twice the amount of energy we use now. Well, maybe the price of energy goes up because we don't have enough generation or infrastructure to handle that increased load. Well, that increase in energy price as a response, as a second order effect to our model, may actually make people use less energy, right? And so there is no way, this model does not attempt to model third, fourth, fifth plus order effects. So that's another thing to be aware of, why it's risky. And so, in summary, to really drive this point home, I'm going to include 3 different images that I think will illustrate what I'm saying. One of them is pretty serious. The other 2 are kind of memes, but they make the point really well, so I've decided to include them. So again, illustrating the pitfalls of extrapolation. If this is these dots here are your real world outcomes, and whatever thing you're measuring is going up, up, up year after year, you may model that it's going to follow this trend line and go way, way up. But in the future, you may get some sort of new input, some sort of new variable or assumption you didn't model for that drastically changes the way that your responses on the y-axis behave. So again, we can't predict the future. Important thing to know. So your trend line may not end up lining up with your true regression function that becomes apparent into the future. This next image is from a web comic called XKCD by Mr. Randall Munroe, who also wrote the excellent book What If? I highly recommend. But he is kind of a math science guy who also makes comics. And this is a absolute classic comic of his called My Hobby is Extrapolating. As you can see, by late next month, you'll have over 4 dozen husbands. Better get a bulk rate on a wedding cake. And so that's just saying, this is this fella's wedding day, and yesterday his wife had 0 husbands. Today he has 1. If I were to extrapolate that out, it's going to be a lot of people living in this house, right? So it's kind of an absurdist example, but it's still... the math behind this is basically, if I have a small sample size one day and a small population size, one relationship, if I extrapolate that, there is inherent danger in getting reliable results that align with reality. So you may have a perfect model mathematically that perfectly explains what has happened in your short sample size or small population size, but it results absurdist outputs from the model. So that's an example of that. And one more funny example for you, an absolute classic tweet. My 3-month-old son is now twice as big as when he was born. He's on track to weigh 7.5 trillion pounds by age 10. Again, so small population size, 1 baby, small sample size, 3 months, Obviously, we all know no human is going to weigh 7.5 trillion pounds. But again, if you had a perfectly correct, in air quotes, model to extrapolate the weight of this child in 10 years, that's what the model would result. And obviously, it's an absurdist result. And so all of this is to say, take care when you're extrapolating. This is not a crystal ball tool. It is a probabilistic tool. And so, these examples are pretty funny, and you may say, what is the point of this? Why, Jeff, did you spend, 1.5 years developing this tool? And why did I do that? I hope for a very good reason. The reason is, rather than abandoning these tools, we can use them as one tool in our tool belt, one input among many, one thing that can help us make good decisions. We want to understand the assumptions explicitly, test them with out of our sample data when possible, test them against real world data, and maintain a healthy skepticism about the predictions, especially for complex systems or long time horizons. That's why we're only modeling 40 years into the future. The models are best viewed as structured ways of thinking about uncertainty rather than an absolute predictor of events that will surely come to pass. And so, All that is to say is that I've used this tool for real world data, for transformer data, for folks that are on the project committee, real municipal utilities, and one REC based out of the state of Iowa. And our results are encouraging. I think it matched real world data in all the instances we modeled for. And, sharing the results of the modeling and predictions with actual, T&D engineers, the folks with the hands on the metal that have to be responsible for these systems, the feedback was great from them. And so all that is to say, it's not a crystal ball. It's a probabilistic tool. We think the right approach is to use it as a tool in your tool belt. I hope this has been a helpful video. And as always, good luck using the tools, and have a good one.